Thank you, Jack, and thank you, Kurtis. My name is David Carlson. I'm the Advocacy Director at Disability Rights Washington, and I'm the boring lawyer for the day. I'm going to run through the law for folks. You're going to hear, like Kurtis, community members who've been engaged in this issue for a long time and have been leading the way in reform that's long overdue. What you're seeing in the statute that was passed this last session is the work of years of work of community members from here in Spokane and other communities around the state. Now, I'm going to talk about two statutes, two laws that were passed this last year. Mainly, I'm going to talk about one. It's often referred to as 1310. And that law provided a framework for a new way of thinking about law enforcement. It's new for law enforcement, but I think a lot of the average person walking down the street would think that that's what's already supposed to be happening in law enforcement. But we'll see the things they changed might surprise you that they weren't that way to begin with. And then there's another law, 1054, that has gotten a lot of questions from law enforcement about how they're supposed to change the tactics they use or the weapons they use in using force. So let's start with that first one, 1310, the overarching one. And that law is not all that complicated. I know there's been a lot of talk, there's ambiguity, it's complicated. As far as statutes go, it's pretty straightforward. There's always going to be some ambiguity, some reasonable people who can read different things into a law. I don't think there's a lot reasonable people can disagree about this law. I think if you're intending to read absurdities into it, you certainly can read absurdities into it, but not reasonably coming up with wildly different interpretations of what's expected here. Now, for those people in the room, you can, there's a resource table near the front door. It has every bill that goes through the legislature has a report written on it that sort of summarizes in plain language, what is this bill trying to do? I think that's an incredibly useful document. I've highlighted sections I'm going to be talking about, so if you want to refer to any of those, feel free to pick up, there are several copies, pick up a copy of that legislative report over there. Now, it starts, that report, that this reform on use of force was intended to protect the constitutional rights of people from excessive force by their government. And I think if we start to dig into this, we'll see they're quite reasonable constraints. So first, law enforcement must use reasonable care. That means they have to try to de-escalate situations. They can only use physical force when they're working on protecting against criminal conduct, or they have where there's probable cause to make an arrest, or they're actually making an arrest, or they're trying to prevent an escape, or they're protecting against bodily injury, either to law enforcement, a member of the public, or maybe that person's trying to hurt themselves. Law enforcement can step in and use force to help that person not hurt themselves or hurt somebody else. They can only use deadly force if there's an imminent threat of serious physical injury or death. That sounds pretty reasonable. I think if you ask the average person walking down the street, when should police be able to kill somebody? It's only if they're pretty sure that imminently that person might seriously harm someone else or kill someone else. That's not an extreme expectation. It also asks that they use the least amount of force necessary in these situations. Again, you ask a reasonable person, how much force should a police officer use? Only as much as they need to. I think we all kind of hope and we put trust that that's what's being done, but apparently we had to write it down and put it in a law, and that law is being complained about now. Now, when considering how much force to use, the statute even tries to be really clear. You should consider things like, is the person you're using force on pregnant? Are they a child? Are they someone with a physical or cognitive disability? Are they someone who's labeled a vulnerable adult? That's often someone who's older. Are they someone with limited English proficiency? I think the legislature was being very helpful to law enforcement in saying, we'll help you think through this. Here are some examples of things you should consider in what is the right amount of force to be using in a certain situation. And that you should use less lethal alternatives, and your law enforcement agency should provide those less lethal alternatives to you. You should get training on how to use these less lethal alternatives, how to do de-escalation, how not to use lethal force on people who themselves are not all that dangerous. And that local governments and local law enforcement agencies can even raise the bar from here. They said, we're putting it at a pretty reasonable level. We think everyone can agree. But if your local city wants to say, no, we're going to restrict it even further, there's still room to do that. Now, with that backdrop, they said, here's some things that are going to be off limits. And so they passed 1054. And that says no holds, no choke holds. What is that? That's a hold that is intended to stop your breathing. It's not to constrain you, keep you in one spot, to stop your breathing. Or a hold that is intended to stop the blood from going to your head so you pass out. Also, there is a work group that has been convened to examine how canines are used. In our community, recently we've seen some problematic canine use. And the legislature said, yeah, we want the Criminal Justice Training Center and a group of stakeholders to examine canine use and come back and explain to us what they think should happen further there. The legislature also said tear gas is off limits except for certain situations. So what are those? These are the situations you'd think, well, that would be the only place to use tear gas, right? Where else should we be using it? Riots. There's a barricaded subject in some building, or there's a hostage situation. And you have to try everything else you can before you start using tear gas. You have to inform the person, hey, we're going to use tear gas, so you better give up now. Give them an opportunity to comply. And if the riot that you're going to use tear gas is in some community setting, not like in a jail or prison, you have to ask the highest elected community leader in that area, can we use tear gas on this riot? That's the requirements. It's, now, then it goes on to military equipment, and we've heard some talk of this. We've heard talk of the firearm ammunitions of 50 caliber or more. Let's see some of the other things that are lumped in there and see if we can determine whether or not they intended to put beanbags in this category. Machine guns, armed helicopters, armed and armored drones, armed vessels, armed vehicles, armed aircraft, tanks, long-range acoustic hailing devices, rockets, rocket launchers, bayonets, grenades, missiles, and directed energy systems and electromagnetic spectrum weapons. I think we can easily read this law and the one I talked about earlier about using less lethal measures and see there's a difference between the 50 caliber that's referenced here and the beanbags that are actually explicitly referenced as a less lethal option in the other law. And then finally, law enforcement have to make themselves visible in some fashion, wearing a uniform or identifying police in their name. And there are limits on vehicular pursuit, kind of similar to the use of force. It has to be pretty serious. And then also the prohibition against no-knock warrants. That's where you can be sleeping and they just kick down your door without knocking and announcing themselves. So that's, and it's not highly used, but it apparently needs to be explained that that can be a dangerous situation. I think we can all imagine how it'd be quite dangerous for someone to not announce that they're law enforcement and then enter someone's home with guns drawn. So that's what the laws say. They seem pretty reasonable to me. I understand I'm a lawyer, I'm an advocate, that makes me unreasonable by nature. But I think the general public can hear what they put in there, the legislature, and say, that sounds pretty reasonable. And then ask yourself, like Kurtis said, why is the complaint here? And of course there's going to be resistance to having to change the way you operate. But these are not unreasonable changes that are being requested, and they reflect the will of the people. The Spokane voters overwhelmingly approved Initiative 940 several years back. This is a continuation of that work to bring our law enforcement practices on the books into alignment with what the community expects. And We hope that the Attorney General's office will see the urgency of pushing forward and issuing more guidance to resolve any possible reasonable or unreasonable questions that may be raised so that we can move forward with a more accountable, responsive law enforcement system in our state. Thank you.